One of the key things that I gleaned from the literature on the therapeutic use of psilocybin for the treatment of depression is that very seldom do people who take psilocybin experience long-term issues with memory. Why is that so critical? Well, you could imagine that increasing connectivity in the brain, reducing modularity, reducing hierarchical organization of the brain would lead to disruptions in memory, right? It's as if you're shuffling books on the bookshelf, so to speak, but that doesn't seem to be the case. Rather, it seems that the increase in connectivity is leading, provided set and setting are correct, provided safety protocols are followed, to positive rewiring or adaptive rewiring of neural tissue. So that's one of the things that makes psychedelics and psilocybin in particular very exciting from the therapeutic standpoint. And of course, we have to acknowledge it's also what has a lot of people excited about psychedelics, not just for the treatment of depression, but for expanding the brain's capabilities more generally. So along those lines, I want to touch on the issues of creativity and the experience of life outside of psychedelic journeys is impacted by psychedelic journeys. And here this relates to a question that I heard a lot when I put the call out on social media that I was going to do this episode. And I asked people, what do you want to know about psilocybin? And one of the more common questions that I got was, does it increase creativity? Does it increase our experience of life in ways that are beneficial, aside from its now documented positive effects in treating depression and compulsive disorders and addiction? And the short answer to this is yes, but that the positive effects of psychedelics, psilocybin in particular, on creativity and our experience of life have only been explored in a fairly narrow set of dimensions. However, where it's been explored, there's some really interesting findings. So one of the more interesting findings, I think, is a paper entitled Increased Low-Frequency Brain Responses to Music After Psilocybin Therapy for Depression. I think this is a really interesting paper because what the authors did is they took advantage of the fact that in these therapeutic psilocybin sessions that were carried out for the treatment of depression, music is being played. And there are prior studies showing that when music is played, you activate different brain areas depending on what sort of music is being played. It's somewhat obvious, perhaps, sad music versus, intense, you can think about heavy metal versus choir music versus Gregorian chants versus punk rock music, and on and on. It makes sense that different brain areas would be activated when different patterns of music are played. However, there do seem to be some universal features of brain activation in response to music. This should probably be the topic of an entire episode of the Huberman Lab podcast, and indeed it will be. For instance, there are areas of the auditory cortex that are activated, no surprise there, and areas of the brain's reward circuitry, the so-called ventral striatum and the so-called mesolimbic reward pathway. I talked a lot about these in the episodes about dopamine that I've done previously. These are brain areas that lead to the release of dopamine in other brain areas and that reinforce certain experiences and that tend to give us the subjective feeling of, yes, I like this, I want more. So in this particular paper, what the authors did is they took advantage of the fact that people are in the clinic, they're on psilocybin, they're listening to music, and as you recall, the music played at different stages of the psilocybin journey are different. They have a different emotional component. And music is a really nice stimulus in the laboratory, as we say, because like with visual stimuli, you can break it down into high frequency, low frequency, right? Sounds like doon, doon, or these kinds of things. That was my attempt at low frequency versus high frequency auditory stimuli. Or at the spatial frequency, or what in the auditory domain would be called the temporal frequency. Is it boom, 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 or is it boom, 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 boom? All we've changed there is the temporal frequency. The sound was somewhat the same, but the distance between those sounds was different. You get the idea. So they have access to these people and these different conditions, and they can put them in the brain scanner, and they can do that before and after having taken psilocybin. And the long and short of this study is that psilocybin changes one's experience of music, not just during the psilocybin journey itself, but thereafter. And in fact, it changes one's emotional response to music in very interesting ways. For instance, one of the more common features of major depression is that people don't derive as much pleasure from different types of experiences, whether or not it's food or sex or social experiences, to the point where sometimes they just stop trying to seek out those experiences. People with depression often feel as if music no longer has the same impact. It just doesn't really lift them up very much. This study found that people who have taken psilocybin, according to the parameters we talked about earlier, can get a return of the elevated emotionality, the positive emotions associated with music that formerly made them feel good. In other words, they can feel music again. They can feel good in response to music again. Now, this is interesting because in theory, it could be that psilocybin simply allowed them to access the emotions around music again more generally. But that's actually not what this paper and some other papers that have been published report. Rather, it seems that taking psilocybin can increase one's positive perception of music that one likes and can tone down or reduce the depressiveness or the sadness of music that tends to make one sad, even after the psilocybin has worn off and for a long period of time afterwards, maybe even forever. Although no study, of course, can be carried out forever because forever is forever. What we do know, however, is that psilocybin can rewire the connections between the emotion centers in the brain and the networks that control auditory perception of music, and leads to this condition in which people who felt like, I was depressed or I couldn't feel the music, I just wasn't getting the same lift and joy from it again, they can start to experience more joy from that music again. And that music that made them feel sad and depressed has a diminished capacity to make them feel sad and depressed. And there's a lot of neuroimaging data in this paper that point to the specific brain areas that include areas like the ventral tegmental area that can explain why these sorts of effects would occur.